world-renowned for his work in the science of perception. 2, he is a professor of neuroscience at the University of London, as well as a visiting scholar at New York University. And 3, he is a CEO. He's founder and CEO of 2 companies. Ripple, which holds several highly influential patents in augmented reality, and another organization, Lab of Misfits, which brings together as a first neurodesign studio science, art, and design. And they've published over 70 studies, research papers full of data, and worked with many major brand organizations. Beau has done 3 main stage TED Talks with over 9 million views, and he is the author of 3 different books, the most recent being Deviate, the Science of Seeing Differently. As you were signing on, I mentioned that Beau loves interaction. So if it's all possible to turn your cameras on, he'd love to see your faces. That really helps him relate to you and engage. And then you'll be able to ask questions either by raising your hand using that feature or speaking in the chat room. We will honor our 30-minute time period today, but those of you who have been here before know that we often stay on for after the show. And so if we have any questions that are unanswered, Beau's agreed to stay on and answer those. So with that, Beau, I would like to say welcome.
Thank you, Gail. And it's lovely to be here. And thank you for the invitation. And hello, everybody, wherever you are. I'm sitting in Bristol right now. I'm in the UK, so Bristol's there behind me.
I know I said, Beau, it's nighttime. And he said, that's all right. So Beau and I had this great call to prep for this. And I just am eager to dive right in. And my first question, Beau, for everyone here is, let's just talk about this topic of uncertainty. Why is it that we as humans dislike uncertainty so much?
Why do we hate uncertainty? It's because it's the fundamental problem that the brain evolved to solve. And during evolution, if you couldn't solve it, you died, because we evolved to predict. And the better you're able to predict, the better you're able to survive. So when your brain experiences a situation where you don't know, it tells you, I don't want to be here. I want to be anywhere else but here. And so often we go to panic, because when you face that, your ancestors faced that, they actually increased the chance that they weren't going to survive. So you could argue that almost every single behavior we do is an attempt to decrease uncertainty. There's only one context really where we actually seek uncertainty, but almost everything else we actually try to decrease it. So it's a fundamental challenge.
What is the context of when we seek it?
Okay. So actually, I'll ask everybody here. So think to yourself, where do you actually love uncertainty? What's the context where you don't just tolerate it, you actually love it, you seek it out, right? It's a single word. Think to yourself, where do you love it? Anyone? Shout out if you, I mean, Gail, for you, what for you is actually, can you think of the context where you actually love uncertainty? It's play. It's play. Play is evolution's solution to uncertainty. It's why play evolved, right? And what we know is that the most successful systems, the most adaptable systems, are the ones that actually play into adulthood. And if you add intention to play, you actually get science. In fact, everything that is creative, you could argue, is play with intention. But it's a really important point, because it also helps us better understand the culture, a corporate culture, a brand culture, that you need to create in order to foster innovation and creativity.
You know, you've built a career on the science of perception. Yeah. Why does any organization really even care about perception? How did science get created around perception? Why is that important?
So the reason why it's important is because everything begins with perception, right? It's not only relevant to understanding how the brain works, it's to understand what it is to be human. Because the clothes you wear, the people you fall in love with, the choices you make, everything begins with perception, right? And what's more, behavioral change begins with perceptual change. So if you want to change people's behavior, you have to understand how, not just what they did and when they did it or where they did it, you have to understand why they did it. Because only then can you actually have choice in yourself, but also within the organization or within the customers that people with whom they're working. Right? Which is why we work so strongly with brands, for instance, in trying to help them better understand not only their internal culture, but actually who is their client. And it's all grounded in perception.
Is there a relationship between how perception underpins bias and then how that relates to diversity?
Yeah, I mean, a fundamental point about perception is that everything you're doing right now, your brain is nothing other than a physical manifestation of your past interactions with the world. And not just your interactions, the interactions of your family, of your culture, of your evolutionary ancestors. But what experience gives you are your assumptions and biases, and you always have them. So you can never step outside your assumptions and biases. What's really important is to know what they are, right? And it's that actually is driving everything that you see and do. And so becoming aware of those assumptions, biases is essential, because first of all, you have to know that you have them. Second, you have to know what they are. And the third is that you have to question them. And in order to better understand what they are, the best person to reveal you to you is usually not you, right? It's usually someone else, which is why diversity is so essential. Because if you give me two different groups, if I'm in a business, in fact, I have two, if I'm in a business, you give me two different groups, one a higher average IQ from the same background, and the other is a lower average IQ from a diverse background, I want the second group. Why? Because we know from mathematics, the most likely best solution exists in a complex search space, which requires a diverse group of people, right? Not everyone from the same background. So diversity from the perspective of biology is essential, right? It's the driver of evolution. It's the driver of innovation. But what so many people forget when they're thinking about human resources and working with groups is that what's essential is the integration across that diversity. It's not enough just to have diversity. You have to integrate. And again, that's where we start getting into that context, that culture of creativity. And that also leads us into leadership, because leadership is essential for creating that space that enables people to integrate across that diversity.
How does adaptability play into this?
So what's interesting is that we on the lab's website, we used to say adapt or die, right? And then COVID came. So we actually had to quickly take that down. But the point is that, again, the most successful systems, they don't just adapt, they're adaptable. And LinkedIn did a survey recently, it was last year, and they asked, what's the most in-demand skill right now? And the number one in-demand skill was creativity. Number three was adaptability. But in my talks, what I argue is that actually creativity falls within adaptability. So adaptability, sort of in more sort of common parlance, is innovation. And innovation has two sides. You have creativity and you have efficiency. And the problem is most companies begin with creativity and they very quickly go to efficiency. It's a great idea, but then they stop. And that would be a brilliant idea if it weren't for the fact that the world changes. But because the world changes, we have to actually find the balance between creativity, which is seeing differently, and efficiency. And then it comes back to that culture that enables you to move between them. So adaptability is essential for an organization, actually for an individual to thrive.
Can you teach adaptability or can you teach creativity?
Yes, I think you can. First of all, I personally don't think there's anything creative about creativity, right? Creativity is actually created from the outside, not from the inside. So when you see someone who's doing something, the metaphor is we often think is they're putting two things that are far apart together. And you think, wow, how did they do that? It's amazing. And the answer is they're not. It's for you that they're far apart. They're just making a step to the next, what we call the next most likely possible. But what's possible for them is determined by their assumptions and biases, which are different because they have a different history, right? So really, creativity, adaptability is a way of being in the world. So that's why when I talk, I don't, often CEOs, leadership, they want people to be creative, right? And my point is that they can't just become creative when they walk through the door. They have to live creatively. And this all comes back to conflict in many sense. It's all about how do you engage in conflict to engage in a situation that's different from what you expect. You're now in conflict. Now, when we're in play, we love conflict. Not knowing who was going to win the Super Bowl is why it was fun, right? If you already knew, you weren't going to watch. But in other conflicts, we think, I'm not going to move. So Gail, if you and I are in conflict, the way we've been taught in businesses and in schools is that what I'm going to do is I'm going to put you at the opposite end of the line. And I'm going to try to prove that you're wrong and to shift you towards me. The problem is you're going to try to do exactly the opposite, prove that I'm wrong and shift me towards you. So we set up conflict to win, but not learn, because you only ever learn if you move, right? And that's the irony, is that conflict is a beautiful thing. The problem is not conflict. The problem is how we enter it. What's that culture that enables us to say, I don't know? It's a superhero strength to say, I don't know, right? So we have to think differently about leadership, about leading with questions, not with answers. Design thinking often begins with a problem and they iterate to a better solution. And I say, that's brilliant, but what if it's a bad problem, right? The power is not in the problem, the power is in a brilliant question. But to ask a question, you have to admit that I don't know. So nothing interesting. When I start my talks, I always tell them I want them to know less at the end than they think they know at the beginning, because nothing interesting begins with knowing. It begins with not knowing, right?
You know, one of the interesting things, I see some people on here that organize multiple day events. And I know the placement of speakers is so important for the success of the overall conference. And I think the fact, though, that your preference is to talk about why your plays better at the beginning of a conference.
Yeah, so often people put me at the beginning, sometimes they put me at the end. And the reason is because, first of all, I like to speak with energy and motivate people. I want people to first understand why they fear uncertainty, because it underpins everything they're going to do. But I want them to be excited to go there, right? And often these conferences are about trying to then show examples of how they can see differently. So I want their brain to literally be open to possibility. And then the other speakers can come and say, now this is what it might look like. So what I try to do is give people principles, not rules. The reason why principles are powerful is because they enable people to generalize to new contexts, right? Whereas rules are very efficient, and often people are looking for rules. They just tell me what to do next, right? And that's great if you're trying to be efficient, but if something goes wrong, well, now what are you going to do? But if you have a principle, you can now adapt. So the aim is to give the conference, to lead it, to try to give people that sense of energy and excitement about not knowing, about asking questions, and the principles of how they can then engage when they're now faced with things that they didn't expect. And in this time of COVID, and in fact, it's always been true, we're always being disrupted. And companies and individuals are constantly having to become adaptable. Right. So again, this is not just something that applies in the meeting, it's also something that you can take home and apply in your life.
Well, speaking of applying things to your life, I know that you personally turned all of the uncertainty of 2020 into a real adventure. Can you share? Okay.
Yeah, so my lab and myself have been researching how the brain deals with uncertainty for about 20, 25 years. From the cellular perspective and how your brain cells grow to more the conceptual perspective. And then also the principles of how we can apply it. So I believe in being a trope. You have to be the very thing that you talk about. So back when the first lockdown, actually I was in Britain for the first lockdown, but in June, what I did is I packed up my house in New York, in Manhattan. I moved everything to storage. And then I said, I turned left. I literally turned left. I rented a car and in fact, I turned right to get a lobster roll from Maine. And then I drove left all the way across the country to Seattle. And then I cycled down the West Coast, 1,500 kilometers on my own. Then I drove back across the country. And then I continued the journey. And the point is that we can turn, everything again is about perception. It's how we look at something, right? How you respond to something becomes the meaning of that thing. What your brain is interested in meaning is not interested in data. Data is meaningless. And I can show you all that right now, actually. So what I want you to do is I want you to hold up your finger to me, okay? And line up your finger. You have to move it towards you and away to you until your finger and my face are the same size, okay? So if you do that, right? Now the point is, we're not the same size, right? But your brain, the only information it gets from the world is through your retina. And at that point, your retina was saying your finger and me my head are the same size, but it's not true, right? So your brain's constantly having to deal with this uncertainty. So what I was doing on this journey is trying to figure out how are people solving and dealing with uncertainty? And then how to respond to it again becomes the meaning. And that's what literally gets mapped to your brain. And the meaning of uncertainty can also be adventure. So in a point of adventure, the reason why I went on the adventure is not to embrace, not to step into uncertainty, is to acknowledge the uncertainty that's already there, but to choose to see it in a different way. And we've actually been doing experiments in the lab recently. In fact, you're the very first ones to hear these results, literally. Okay, we were just number crunching today. And we were asking people, when you're on your deathbed and you look back in your life, what do you want to see? In other words, what's your purpose? And many of you will know that brands want to be purpose-driven, for instance. And so we're asking, well, are there some purposes that are better than others when dealing with uncertainty? And people gave us all kinds of questions, all kinds of answers. The most prominent was meaningful, well, actually happiness and meaningful. Others were authentic, inspired, etc., right? And you can go on the lab's website, you can take part of this experiment, it's live, and you can see the results. But what we discovered is that we then asked people, how did you feel about 2020 in terms of stress, uncertainty, growth, humility, etc.? And we found that people who pursue happiness found 2020 to be far more stressful. They had a very difficult experience for 2020. But people who pursue authenticity actually felt they grew, they felt they were more flexible, they felt they were more successful, etc. So in other words, just to be self-honest, to pursue authenticity is so essential. And we know this for brands actually. The most sought after brands are actually the most authentic. And so what the lab actually does is it helps brands exist in the world with authenticity. Otherwise, your purpose is just a slogan, right? We also found, by the way, because I see many of you are women, that women express much more stress during 2020 than men, by the way.
What do you think that is, Beau?
Well, you could answer that for me. I mean, now this is a perceptual measure, right? But of course, I come from a family of 4 older sisters and no brothers, right? And so I'm very aware how so many with children being homeschooled, many, of course, women working just as much as men, and it's still falling onto the plate. So, and also the need for sort of being the focus and support for all of that, right? So I think we're seeing a manifestation of these multi-roles in this time of uncertainty.
Well, we do have some guys on this, and one of them is Ernie, and he has a question that he asked here. He said, it seems like being comfortable with uncertainty is within a growth mindset. Uncomfortable is more at home in a fixed mindset. Would that be a stretch?
No, I think that's very, very well said. So yes, a growth mindset, for those who aren't aware, I will phrase it a bit differently in terms of growth mindset, but it will still capture the point. So my interest is not in changing people's perceptions. It would be arrogant for me to think that any of you should change your perceptions, but we can all expand our perception. Okay. And when you expand your perception, you literally are increasing the connectivity of your brain. You're literally becoming more open. That is what a growth mindset is. To seek understanding, not knowing. So all of you, when you're in a point of conflict, the exercise is to enter that conflict with a question, with the desire to understand. Right? And if that is effectively the growth mindset, I want to understand, not know, right? Understand. Through understanding, you get wisdom. And when you feel like you can understand something, it increases your optimism because you feel more confident that you'll be able to deal with future unknowns when you have that understanding. And what's more, you love not knowing. right? That's the whole point. That's the driver of science, is not knowing. It's not knowing. And science is actually just an iteration to better questions, right? But what you're constantly trying to do is expand, whether it's your relationship with yourself, with another person, your organization, because that's where you get the agility of thought that enables you to thrive.
I want to make sure that everyone knows that if you have additional questions, please raise your hand and we'll bring you up to talk with Beau, or you put them in the chat session. So we're happy to involve any and everyone. Beau, I remember on the planning call, you sharing a story about the difference between a sous chef and a chef.
Yeah.
Can you share that analogy? Because I remember really enjoying that.
Yes. So a sous chef and a chef. So I assume everybody knows the difference between a sous chef and a chef. And I love cooking. Doesn't mean I'm a good cook, but I do love the process of cooking, right? And the way I personally cook is I go to the store and I think, I just find a few things. And then when I get home in the kitchen, I think, now what I'm going to make. And I make it up as I go along. I never use recipes. And the difference between a sous chef and a chef, which is I think our education system and our businesses are trying to create sous chefs, right? Because they're focused on efficiency. Here's the instructions, here's your recipe, here's your ingredients, do it like this, and if you do it right, it'll look like that. There's already a known answer, right? And there's a place for that. Again, I don't want you all, when you leave this, if a bus is coming at you, think, oh, I wonder if there's a different way I can see this. No, you get out of the way as fast as possible, right? So there's a place for efficiency, for being a sous chef, right? But what we really need are chefs. What a chef is able to do is first, if the basil's missing or the basil is missing, the chef is like, okay, now a sous chef is like, I don't know what to do, right? My fundamental ingredient's missing. The dish is going to fail. But a chef knows, he or she knows why the basil's there in the first place. Maybe he or she is trying to create contrast or a certain texture, so they can now adapt. So chefs are adaptable, sous chefs are not. What's more, a chef still has to deliver. They still have 300 plates to cook, right? And that need to deliver is the inspiration for that creativity and innovation. And I know many, many chefs where their kitchen has just been destroyed, but they still have to deliver. And so they'll have their sous chefs going across the street using other kitchens. They're constantly trying to solve those problems, but they have that mindset of adaptability because they understand, they know why, not just what, where, and when, but they know why they're doing what they're doing. And that's what gives them the ability to adapt.
Beau, I have another question over in the chat. It's talking about perception and how do we make sense out of tragedy? This is from my friend Becky, and she just wants to know, like the loss of someone close, how do you change your perception to make sense out of it?
How do you make sense of tragedy? It's a wonderful and powerful question. And something I also do, I work one-on-one with people. I call them one-on-ones. And they're people who are often going through trauma and tragedy in their life. And what I am trying to do when I work with them, it's not about ignoring it. It's not about pretending it didn't happen. It's about understand. First of all, one of the first steps is to get people to feel the feeling, but not attach a meaning to it. Your brain is constantly looking for meaning. It's one of the reasons why when we feel certain symptoms, right, can create a tremendous source of anxiety because we need to know what's causing my illness. And so often actually people who had cancer, for instance, this is how much we need to know and put a meaning to something and a label to something, that as soon as they get diagnosed, they actually get a sense of relief. Ah, at least now I know. And yet the diagnosis is terrible, but that's how strong we need to know. So the aim, my point is that if you want to go from A to B, your first step is not B. Your first step is to go from A to not A, to let go of your assumptions about it, to let go of the meanings. But that doesn't mean you don't feel it. You still feel the feeling, but you don't attach the meaning to it, because what trauma is the meaning that we attach to it. And then the next step is this goes through a number of steps, but what we're trying to do is then grow from it and expand from that possibility. And when we feel like we've expanded, it then turns the pain into something different from trauma. right? Trauma is often we go from pain to not being able to grow from it. So I often say, as I said, you can follow, by the way, this adventure that I went on. And when I cycled down the West Coast, I was in terrible, I wasn't in the shape ready to go 1,500 kilometers, I can tell you. I was test riding my bike. Within 3 minutes, I went up the hill. I was thinking, oh my goodness, I'm exhausted, right? How am I going to make this? And the point is, you get in shape along the way, right? We don't get in shape and then live. You don't get over sadness and then get out of bed. You can use the sadness as the motivation to get out of bed, right? And it's from getting out of bed that the sadness becomes something else. It becomes the inspiration for something, right? And then you re-mean it. Because everything that you do right now will become part of your future past that your brain will use to perceive in the future, right?
You know, when you were talking, I was thinking about so many of the people I see here on the screen are in charge of orchestrating large events, which traditionally have been in person. And many of them have been the key point of trying to change people's perception, whether it's leadership who thinks, well, there's no way we can do this event virtually, or maybe it's attendees who think it won't be the same.
Yeah.
So talk specifically about changing perceptions of this pandemic that has lasted longer than anyone wanted, and how do we embrace this virtual world for the time being and make the best of it and get people to be open?
Right. So in thinking about giving virtual talks, do you mean, and how do we embrace this format in this context? Yeah. There's a number of ways, but first of all, because I like interaction, I still actually do my virtual talks with interaction. So when I do it, I have my slides that can come up here, just like you would see if you're watching a John Oliver. So it's very done in a seamless way. But I still get everybody, as much as possible, to stand up, and I get them to interact and to do things while they're on camera, which is why I so much enjoy seeing you all, right? I still think we can get that level of interaction. You just have to be a bit more creative with it. I think that interaction is very important. There's also an element, though, which is just the power of listening. And often by not having all those other distractions that can happen in the conference, we have that ability to really focus, right? And so what I'm really advocating, and we've done a number of studies on, is the power of touch. And actually, when you listen, you're touching, right? And so there's the power of this medium to facilitate that ability to touch and to be touched through that listening. And there you get transformation.
Well, we are winding up on our 30 minutes. Is there any key takeaways that you would want to leave folks with? Hold on, somebody from a brand, hold on, I'm pausing there and coming with this question. From a brand perspective,
yeah.
How does one marry play, inquiry, and discovery with the need for consistency in order to be readily recognized in the marketplace?
It's a great question. So to be recognized in the marketplace is about, the question is why you're recognized in the first place. And so often businesses aren't aware that what they're actually in the service of. So we've worked with many brands, one of which, for instance, recently was Cirque du Soleil. And Cirque du Soleil, we said, you're not a circus. You're not in the business of circus. What you're in the business of is awe and wonder. That's why people are buying a ticket. They're not going there to see clowns. They're going in there to feel a feeling. So let's measure that feeling. So we measured the brain and the behavior before and after and during the performance. And what we discovered is that people were experiencing awe and wonder during the performance. But then we also measured who cares? And we found that people became more tolerant to risk, more open to possibility, more pro-social. That then became part of the whole PR and marketing strategy, both in better understanding why they exist, because they wanted to become the world's largest live entertainment, not just circus, which suited them very well. How do we create awe and wonder then? We can do that in lots of different ways. So suddenly by understanding that, it made them far more adaptable and resilient to change. It also increased loyalty for their audience, but it also increased internal loyalty, Because now when someone is going to work, they're not going to work to make a circus, as wonderful as that may be. They're going to facilitate on wonder in people. And that on wonder is going to have this impact, right? So we now are working with other businesses about not only understanding the purpose, but bringing it into the world that then becomes part of their PR and marketing strategy, right? And now they're actually facilitating the very thing that they're trying to. And now, it increases retention of their audience, the retention of their employees. It actually works as a recruitment strategy, because who doesn't want to come to a company that's actually facilitating empowerment through their product?
Great. That's great. That's a great answer. Okay, we are at the 30-minute mark, so I know some of you have to hop off, and if you have enjoyed this and you want to be with us next time, it'll be March 8th with Lisa Gibbons, who is an Emmy Award-winning winner, who is known for being on air and kind of a pop culture icon. For those of you who have time and you want to stay on, we might just grab a few more minutes with Beau to talk about virtual presentations. Thank you as always. And if you're interested in bringing Beau in to speak to your organization, please don't hesitate to give us a call. He's really enjoying doing this virtually, and we'd love to work with you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
So Beau, I'm curious, what are you seeing that's working really well in virtual events versus some pitfalls we need to try to avoid?
I think one of the things we want to try to avoid is to try to recreate the live event, right? And to actually work with the technology in the way that enables us to work. And of course, we're still sort of developing this. But as we were talking about before, there are some advantages to working in this way. And one of the strategies that we've also been doing is to do talks over time. So sometimes I work with organizations and I will do an hour a week for 4 weeks, right? Or 30 minutes a week for 4 weeks, or, so we can stretch it out. And what's really interesting with that is that sometimes, like all of us, we'll come to a presentation and we'll listen for 45 minutes. We think, oh, that's wonderful, hopefully. And then, then we wake up the next day, right? But when you get the repetition that you're coming back each time, then there's that dedication. And so there's something called the IKEA effect. The more effort you put into something, the more you like that something, right? So hence the IKEA, you put an effort into building a table, you like that table better than if you just bought it off the shelf, right? So getting people to put effort into something. It's also why I try to get people to do an interaction. It's not just to be playful. It's because I want people to embody what I'm saying, because your brain is embodied. When I get them to physically interact and to do stuff, their body and their brain is now becoming a better understanding of what I'm talking about, not just a regurgitation of it. So, but I still think we can do this virtually, and we can build on the tools that are available. And we can also sometimes even dip in and have it be more frequent over time, as well as the formats that we're typically doing.
I've got 2 more questions over in the chat. One person said that they're hearing from some planners that recording the main talk and then the speaker comes back on. So pre-recording the main talk, yeah, and then coming on later for a live Q&A. And that would be more of the interactive part. Do you think that works? Yes,
that's worked. I've done that as well. I've also done it more. So I've done that and I think that works. So that becomes a catalyst for a conversation. And of course, how you then stage that becomes a question. But anytime we can get that conversation, and having these small groups, I think is quite effective. Now, what's also just as a strategy personally is when we have the webinars, and when I do the webinars, I can't see anyone. And I still do it because, you try to be professional and you do it well, right? Though you're talking to yourself. I think there's an opportunity to combine webinars with this type of format, where you have some people who maybe have more exclusive access, where they get to see themselves and they get to see other people. Because there's something that we're missing with webinars is contagion. One of the powerful things about sitting in an audience is that someone laughs next to you, you're more likely to laugh. And we know from research that goes for about 4 people away, by the way. It's not the whole room, it's only up to about 4 people, right? So being able to see other people, to hear other people, I think is actually quite powerful. And then you can actually scale that, but it can also be offered as an opportunity, right? To be able, and then those people are the ones who maybe can also ask questions. So I think there are opportunities there as well.
I like that. So, Beau, earlier I missed a question on the chat about your content, so I definitely want to circle back to that. How do we expand our mind in an era of limited space, poor interaction, and limited access to nature?
How do we expand our, with limited access to nature? Yes, it's a great, I like that. So first of all, the aim is to expand your mind, to expand your space of possibility. And first of all, it's really interesting. We can actually do this through technology. So I'll make a more general point, which is it's about travel. Okay, now that seems like a contradiction, right? Because how can we travel at this time? You can still travel in your mind. Is to experience something that's different from what you expect. Reading a book, right? Engaging with people that you don't normally engage with in conversation and seeking to understand them. Because when you seek to understand them, it actually reveals more about you than it does about them, right? So it's to experience diversity and difference, but then to try to find integration with that. And in doing so, it's again, not think about in terms of people. So often, especially in the States, we have it in the UK as well, but in the States, where we often seek validation in a conversation or in a conflict. Well, if you can only talk to the people that you're going to validate, that's a very few number of people. But I tend to separate understanding from validation. First, seek understanding, because you can't validate them if you don't know why they're doing what they do. And in doing so, you might actually learn something about them and about yourself. Only then you can think about, well, now maybe let's think about those biases and assumptions that I now understand, because everybody makes sense to themselves, just not to other people, right? And so when we do that, that enables us to expand our own mind, because now you've learned something, right?
This is great. I love it. Seek understanding, not validation. That's my takeaway. Thank you so much for your time. I know it's late over in the UK, and I appreciate you being here. And all of you who are here today, thank you so much for your time. Let us know if we can help you in any way. And if you have more questions, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll get them to Beau and we'll get you an answer. Thanks.
Thanks.
Have a fantastic week. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.